Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to go through the various government policies kind of through the years on housing and how they affect the housing market. So the first thing is height restrictions. Okay. And so in many cities, there's a cap on how high you can build. This is kind of outside of zoning. Zoning is its own thing. So this is kind of like just overall there are height restrictions. Okay. So when you see like DC is a very flat city. Why is it flat? Well, there are height restrictions. You can't build above a certain height. What this is going to do, taking our monocentric city model, so naturally, so you say, naturally the city is going to have this shape where lots of density in that city center. What a housing, what height restrictions do is they effectively cap how dense a city can be. And that's going to push a bunch of the population to the suburbs, increase traffic, increase commute times, all that. Okay. And so, why do people do it, or why would you do it? It basically just has negative outcomes. It just makes housing more expensive, makes commuting costs higher, and it's worse for the environment. Um, well, one reason is you want to preserve kind of the local character. The other reason is, these big buildings cast shadows. It's just kind of annoying. And so there's kind of just, this usual people who don't like to live near big buildings. So there's kind of this just anti sentiment. Um, and one good solution that Paris and London have is like, okay, we're going to keep a historic area. We're going to keep part of the city historic, but we're going to allow that height somewhere else. So that basically allows us to have it both ways. We can have really, really dense area somewhere in the city, but we're going to keep the historic character in other areas. So visually, this is what it looks like. Here's your historic area of Paris. And there in the background, you can see La Defense. I don't know how to say it. I don't know how to say it in French, but that's kind of the CBD. That's where the urban core or the density is. Similar with London, it has some historic areas allowing density here. Okay. Another solution is to have tradable height restrictions. So essentially, allow each plot of land to have certain maximum height, but if it doesn't want to use that height, essentially, if I'm in my house right here, and if I'm allowed to say build 6 stories, what I can do is if I only want to have 1 story, I could take those 5 stories that I'm not using, sell them to somebody else. And now I'm capped at 1 story and I've sold my 5 stories to someone nearby. So if somebody wants to put a high rise in here above 6 stories, they can buy up everybody's height restrictions and then put it up. Okay. That way, what that does is essentially it allows the people who would experience the negative externality to benefit from it. So if somebody's putting a high rise next door to me, above what the limit is, say it's 6 stories, if they're putting it above that, the only way they can really do that is to buy the height from me. And therefore, I'm being compensated because I'm going to be living next to a high rise. They're basically paying it for me. And so in the US, we kind of have this. The only place we really have this is Manhattan. And so you can basically they can sell their air rights in Manhattan. All right. And so you can see this building right here purchased air rights. Okay. And so this is an example what we call a market-based solution over a command and control approach. A command and control approach is where the government just regulates how high housing is. Market-based solution says, okay, you can kind of put a cap in, but then let people figure it out amongst themselves. If somebody wants to go bigger, they could pay for it. All right. If somebody doesn't want to go as big as the government says, they can actually benefit from it. All right. And so this is kind of a new development in property rights. So we don't really know how it is, but generally, as economists, we prefer the market-based solution over the command and control approach. We tend to think it leads to more overall efficient outcomes. Another nice thing about it too is if you buy up the air rights around you and you build up a high rise, no new high rise is going to come up and block the views because you essentially own the air rights around your buildings. Another advantage to it. Sometimes this can really hurt property values. If for instance, I had a buddy who bought an apartment in kind of the Wilshire corridor in LA, and he had inside information that there was going to be a big high rise going up across the street from him, blocking the view of that apartment. He was able to sell the apartment before that became public knowledge, and decrease the value of his apartment. That's not really fair. If we have these tradable air rights, that becomes public knowledge. Okay. Another big government intervention in the housing market is the mortgage interest deduction. So the history of this is very interesting, but basically what it is if you have a mortgage, okay? So you've bought, what a mortgage is, if you don't know, is you bought, that's when you borrow money to buy a house. So a house costs a certain amount, you borrow the money from the bank, and then you pay the bank back each month. Part of what you're paying back is interest on your loan, okay? The part that you pay back that's interest, you are allowed to deduct from your taxes. Basically, you get a tax break. Okay, I know this is all boring. Nobody cares. You're all 18, 19. You're not thinking about buying a house. Um, but this is incredibly important. So basically, people who own homes, especially expensive homes, because they get to deduct this interest. The interest is more on expensive homes, have a tax break, a massive tax break that renters or people who own their homes outright don't have. Okay, and this is basically, probably in the present, this is more close to $100 billion of foregone revenue for the federal government. Okay, this is really a result of a quirk of history. So when the income tax passes during World War I, they allow people to deduct interest. The idea being, well, we don't want to penalize businesses for borrowing to invest in their business. Okay. And also, home prices are cheap here. People usually bought their house outright. So this was never foreseen to be used for housing. So, but what happened was, let's see if I have it. Yeah. So what happened was basically some clever tax lawyers figure out in the 1930s that if I have a client who's bought a house and they're paying a mortgage with interest, technically this applies. This law applies to it. So where they started using it to get these people who had mortgages tax breaks. Then it becomes common practice. And once everyone starts doing it, it's hard to take away. So once you give people a goodie, it's hard to take away the goodie. So once all the homeowners got used to deducting their interest, it was impossible for the government to take it away. I mean, try getting elected. I mean, if you're running for office saying, we're going to get rid of mortgage interest reduction, good luck. Every homeowner is going to vote against you, and the homeowners always vote. So it's kind of this, it's a very regressive tax, um, favoring homeowners at the expense of renters that we have because of a quirk of history, and it's impossible to get rid of. So the outcome of this is that it encourages homeownership. Now, later on, people use this as a justification for it, that, hey, this thing encourages homeownership. Homeownership is good, so this is why we should have it. As I mentioned, really, it's a tax break for homeowners who are generally doing well at the expense of renters who are, you typically tend to be lower income. So this is probably the most regressive tax in the world. Basically, renters are paying for homeowners, and really, it really alters um, what the urban landscape looks like. Okay, because here's what happens: if you are wealthy, or not even wealthy, if you're like middle income, middle to upper income, what you want to do is own a house. For years, when I would go to pay my taxes, go to my tax guy, he would yell at me for not owning a house. He'd say, "What are you doing? You got to buy a house, get a massive tax break." I'm saying, "Look, I live in LA. I can't afford a house, guy." He said, "Buy anything." He says, "Buy anything because you'll get a massive tax break." So for the middle upper income people, the tax law incentivizes them. Also, when you do a house, you could do all sorts of, when you remodel, it's like you get all these other deductions. Anyways, so there are this massive incentive built into our tax law encouraging homeownership, basically pushing people towards homeownership. Homeownership traditionally is a detached house, like a single family house. That is usually what homeownership looks like. The reason for that is condos, the governance is much more complicated. So if you have like an apartment building or condos, the governance there, if somebody owns, in that, the governance of that is very difficult usually. It's hard. It's much easier for a landlord to own it and then manage, rather than each individual person owning, an apartment. Because then what happens in that case, all those individuals have to get together in some way, with with a board to manage the overall building. How are we going to do landscaping? How are we going to do repairs? That sort of thing. It's much easier for someone to own it and then rent it out. That's just a more efficient way to do it. So what homeownership looks like is usually single family housing. So since we've incentivized single family housing, our cities have more single family housing. Therefore, they're less dense. We have longer commute times, worse for the environment. So basically, what this policy does is it again makes our cities less dense. It encourages that sort of less dense housing. Back to our monocentric city model, effectively what it's doing is it's adding this. It's lowering the price of housing. It's putting a delta on here for the price of housing, lowering it, basically moving this budget constraint up. This budget constraint 2, which is the people who live further away from the city, moving that up, making them basically encouraging people to move away from the city center, all right, and buy more housing, buy bigger housing, all right. Okay. And so what you're doing is you're pushing people away from the city center. All right. You're pushing the price down out here, making people move away from the city center. Okay. Pushing, pushing less people living here near the city center, moving to the suburbs. So again, it's this height restrictions and this mortgage interest deduction is encouraging less dense housing. All right. Which is bad for the environment in a number of ways, increasing commuting costs. Okay. All right. The only way this law would make sense is if there are some large positive externalities of homeownership that just don't exist. Okay. All right. And this is one thing that almost all economists agree on: get rid of the mortgage interest reduction. I challenge you to find an economist that thinks we should have the mortgage interest deduction. All right. Again, because of political incentives, it's impossible to get rid of. We are stuck with the mortgage interest deduction. Okay. All right. Take a break there.